For a moment, Barney's brain bounced back to the first time he had fallen down the chalk cliff and met Stig. Then he opened his eyes and saw, not the face of the cliff with daylight at the top, but the pattern of beech boughs through which the full moon looked down at him. Then there was a rustle of branches, and he could see Lou clambering down towards him. She fell off the last low bough and ran to where he was lying. "Barney," she was saying, "are you all right, Barney?" He sat up. "Course I'm all right," he said. "Bit scratched, that's all. Why didn't you stay up there if you didn't want to be caught?" "I thought you were hurt, or I would have," said Lou, looking around anxiously. Shadowy figures were moving towards them through the wood. One of them, with tousled head, skin skirt and flint spear, came into the moonlit patch. Lou drew away from it, but Barney knew who it was. "Hello, Stig," he said. "What are you doing here?" Stig's teeth flashed in the moonlight, and then he looked curiously at Lou. "Oh, this is only my sister, Stig," said Barney. "Is this really Stig?" whispered Lou. "Yes, of course," said Barney. "My friend, Stig." "Oh," said Lou. Good evening, Mr. Stig." Stig merely grinned again in a friendly way and said nothing. "Doesn't he speak English?" whispered Lou. "No," replied Barney. "What does he speak then? Latin or French?" "Don't know," said Barney. "You might try him." Lou didn't seem to be able to remember anything suitable to say to a savage spearman in the moonlit wood, so she said nothing. Meanwhile, other figures had appeared from the shadows and were standing round in a circle, watching them. Stig made a few strange sounds, and they lowered their weapons. Then an argument broke out, with a lot of waving of arms towards the camp and pointing of fingers at Barney and Lou. Finally Stig smiled at them, held out his two hands to them, and made ushering movements. "I think we're invited to the party," said Barney. They moved off through the wood in a silence that was broken by a barking and whining, and there in the dark was Dinah, jumping around at the end of her string. Lou ran up to her. "Poor Dinah," she said. "Did we leave you in the dark then?" "It's all right, Dinah. It's only Barney's friend Stig and the other nice gentleman." Dinah didn't seem at all too sure about the other nice gentleman, and stood there growling in her throat until Stig came up and said something, and she actually licked his hand. "That's funny," Lou whispered. "Dinah seems to know Stig." "Well, why not? Probably meets him when she goes rabbiting," said Barney. "You know, in the old days, I mean, when things were usual." They were on the forest track now, so narrow that they had to go in single file and not talk. But soon they came out from the edge of the wood onto the bare top of the hill, and now the women and bigger children who had not dared to go into the dark wood ran up to stare at them. "I don't suppose they've ever seen anything like us," Lou whispered. Barney took a look at Lou in the bright moonlight. "Well, I don't know," he said. "You can't see yourself, Lou. You don't look much different from them, except your hair's fair." Lou felt her tangled hair and looked at her ripped shorts, then looked at Barney with his legs all smeared with green from the bark of the trees. "You don't look very different yourself," she said. They were walking over the smooth turf towards a cluster of huts. The armed tribesmen were on either side of them, and it was difficult for them to feel sure whether they were prisoners or guests. As they came near the huts, Lou said, "I thought Stigs were cavemen." "So they are. My friend Stig is anyway," said Barney. "So what have they got huts for then?" asked Lou. Barney thought for a moment as they passed the huts. They were not much more than shelters, a few long branches tied together at the tops, thatched with leaves and bracken. "Perhaps they're cavemen on holiday," he said. There was a holiday feeling about the tribe. They were sitting round the fires from which there came smells of roasting meat. The men were together in groups. The women were looking after the meat on the spits or holding sleeping babies. Barney looked at a group of boys who were rolling and wrestling on the ground and whispered, "Do you think we'll be allowed to play with them?" "Better not," Lou whispered back. "We'll have to say, 'How do you do?' to whoever's giving the party first anyhow." She tried to comb her hair with her fingers, but Barney, after taking a few leaves and twigs out of his, decided it wasn't worth trying. They passed into the circle of firelight, and the crowd, who had been talking among themselves quite quietly before, fell silent and everyone was looking at them. They walked in silence round the edge of the circle. Barney heard a very small whisper from Lou. "Remember when we were bridesmaid and page at the wedding?" He did remember, and the feeling was about the same as when they had walked into the church with the bride, but this time they were the most important people in the procession. On the other side of the circle was a group of older men, and in the middle there was a figure sitting on a tree trunk. As they went nearer, they could see that he had white hair, very bright black eyes, and was dressed in some very silky fur, with necklaces and bangles of animals' teeth. They didn't need to be told that this was the chief. Barney felt the black eyes boring into him, and suddenly all the rest of the party fell flat on the ground. "Lou, what happened?" he whispered very small. "They all fell down." Then he saw that Lou was trying to curtsy, which looked a bit silly with bare legs and torn shorts, and he thought it might be good manners to bow. The chief, or king, or whoever he was, seemed satisfied with his touch-the-toes bend and Lou's contortions, and a smile appeared on his face. In fact, Barney thought he was going to laugh. But then the king looked stern again and barked a short question at Stig, who had now stood up again. It obviously meant, "What on earth have you got here?" And Stig began to speak. Barney was amazed. He thought of all the time he had spent with Stig, when they'd hardly said a word to each other, though they had understood each other well enough. And here he was, making a speech like someone on the wireless. It sounded wonderful, but he didn't understand a word of it. "What's he saying?" whispered Lou. "He's saying how we came here," said Barney. "Well, how did we?" Lou whispered again. "You know," said Barney. "I jolly well don't know," said Lou quite crossly. "That's why I want to know what he's saying." It would be interesting, thought Barney, as the speech went on and on. At one point, Stig would wave his spear towards the North Star. At another, he would thump himself over the heart and slap Barney on the back. "He's saying I'm his friend," said Barney. "It's a jolly good thing you are too," muttered Lou. Barney felt proud. Stig stopped. There was a silence as the chief seemed to think for a while. Then he rose to his feet. He spoke in a strong, majestic voice, turning his head first to Lou and Barney, then to one side of the assembled tribe, and then to the other. He raised his arms to the stars, waved his hand at the moon, placed both hands over his heart, and then seemed to be blessing the children and the rest of the tribe. "I think he's friendly too," whispered Barney. The chief had finished, and there was silence again. Everyone seemed to be looking at Barney and Lou, and an awful thought came into Barney's mind. "Lou," he whispered in the silence, "I think it's our turn to make a speech." "Well, go on then," said Lou. "I don't know the language." "I thought you didn't," Lou said unkindly. "Do it in English then." "I don't know what to say," said Barney, quite sure that whatever happened, he wasn't going to make a speech. "You do it." "Why should I?" "You're always good at talking. Go on," said Barney. He could see that Lou wasn't sure whether to be pleased or not at this remark, but it felt as if the silence had gone on for hours. Lou looked around desperately, took a deep breath and started. "Mr. Chairman, Headmistress, Governors, ladies and gentlemen." Gosh, that's not right. Lucky you can't understand English. "It is with great pleasure that I come here today to present the prizes at your speech day. Remember, girls, that school days are the happiest days of your life. We can't all win prizes, but—" "Go on, Lou," said Barney. "That's jolly good." "But I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. It droppeth like the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that scratch. Beware the Jub bird and shun the Vorpal Tum tree." How does it go, Barney? "You're doing jolly well, Lou," exclaimed Barney. "Poetry." "Christmas is coming," said Lou, getting the hang of it, and spreading out her arms to the audience. "The geese are getting fat," she declaimed, pointing at the moon. "Please," she begged, holding out her hand. "Put a penny," she paused, "in the old man's hat," she finished, with her hand on her heart. "That was super, Lou," said Barney. "I wish I'd done it now." "Well, you can next time," said Lou, wiping her brow. But it seemed to have worked. The chief smiled at them, and waved them to sit down near him. Then he looked at Dinah, standing rather unhappily beside Lou on the end of her string. He motioned to Lou to bring this strange, tame animal to her, and Lou let the dog up and said, "Shake hands with the nice chief, Dinah." Dinah didn't feel like raising a paw, but the chief gently stroked her back and ears, then ran his hand over the skin he was wearing and said something in his strange language. "He's saying what a nice coat Dinah's got," said Lou, pleased because she had brushed it such a lot. "Probably saying what a nice coat it will make for him," said Barney, but Lou just said, "Oh, Barney, don't," and pulled Dinah to her side. They sat at the side of the royal party and waited, and they had a strange feeling that everyone else was waiting too, waiting for something special. The tribesmen were just sitting around, talking in low voices, and sometimes everyone stopped talking altogether and just listened, and the chief seemed to have his eyes fixed on the mists at the bottom of the valley. A man came from the back of the crowd carrying 2 bull's horns, which he offered to Barney and Lou. "What are we supposed to do with these?" Barney asked Lou. "Blow them?" Lou took one. "Careful, Barney," she said. "There's something in them." Barney took his. It was full of some liquid. They looked at the chief and the old men and saw that they were holding horns too. Then the chief lifted his to his mouth, drank whatever it was in one swig, and threw the horn over his shoulder. "It's to drink," said Barney, and they both realised they were thirsty and took a deep swallow from the horns. Then they both made the same face. "Ugh!" Lou spluttered. "Beer!" Barney just threw his full horn over his shoulder. A rather fat, sleepy tribesman sitting behind him got most of the beer in his face. He seemed surprised, but didn't seem to mind very much as he licked the drops running down his nose. Lou got rid of hers much more carefully. Now the food was coming round. Men were standing near the fires taking the meat off the spits and cutting it up, and others came running with smoking joints, which they handed first to the chief and then to the other important men and to the children. The smell had been delicious, but when they looked at the stringy blackened meat on the bones they had been handed, they didn't feel so hungry. "Do you think it will be bad manners if we don't eat it?" Lou said doubtfully. "Perhaps you don't have manners," said Barney. "And it can be good manners to throw your cup over your shoulder." "The chief did it, so it must be," said Lou. "You can't tell with manners." They looked at the chief again. He had gnawed the meat off his bone in no time, and now he flung it backwards to the rear of the crowd, where it was seized by one of a pack of wildish dogs that were waiting around. "Oh well, that's easy," said Lou. "Here you are, Dinah, nice bone, with meat on." Barney also handed his piece to the dog, and Dinah gnawed away happily like the rest of the tribe. At last the champing jaws on all sides died away, fingers were wiped on the grass or in their hair, and the tribe settled down again with their air of waiting for something. Barney, who was lying back on the soft turf, heard it first. "What's that?" he exclaimed, sitting up suddenly. "What's what?" Lou asked. "Something in the ground," said Barney. Now that he was sitting up, he couldn't hear it. He lay down again and put his ear to the ground. The sound came again, a sort of thumping. He made Lou put her head to the ground, and for a time they heard nothing, and then the thump came again. By now there was a shushing among the tribe, and some of them seemed to be hearing something too. Everyone became quite silent, and after a time the sound could be heard through the air, as well as being a shake in the hillside. There was a long time between thumps. Barney counted up to 20, quite slowly, but they kept coming, and they seemed to be coming closer. It could have been the footsteps of some great giant or monster, plodding unhurriedly towards them out of the marshy valley. Barney looked at Lou, and he could see that she was thinking the same thing. "What can it be, Lou?" he whispered. "I don't know. Could be anything. Could it be one of those brontosauruses?" But Lou hushed for silence, and then Barney too caught another sound that went with each of the thumps of the footsteps. Before each thump there was a sort of long drawn wail that sounded like "Ew thump, ew thump," and each time the whole chalky hill shook until they could feel it in their bones sitting on the springy turf. Everyone had heard it now, even the chief and the old men, who Barney supposed might be a little deaf. The circle of tribesmen round the fire was breaking up, and everyone was moving toward the edge of the steep slope that plunged down to the valley. "Come on," said Barney. "We've got to see what it is." They got up and ran after the others. At the bottom of the valley, the forest stretched away to the distant hills under the moonlight, and blankets of low mist lay with the trees poking their heads through them. They strained their eyes to see through the mist where the sound seemed to be coming from. Then Lou gasped and clutched Barney's arm and pointed. "Look," she breathed. "There it is." Barney saw it almost at the same moment, though he still didn't know what it was he saw. Out of the mist at the base of the hill, there heaved itself every now and then a dark shape that stood up for a moment, then each time fell forward in their direction. And every time it appeared, there came this wail, followed by the earth-shaking thump. And now there seemed to be an extra sound attached to it, between the wail and the thump, like this. "Ew, thump, ew, thump, ew, thump." And the sound seemed to be not one voice, but many voices. And then Barney could see that the dark shape had sort of strings or feelers joined to it. Dinah, standing between them, had seen it now, and the hair was standing up on her neck and back, and Barney felt his was too. Still watching, fascinated, Lou said, "Barney, we're dreaming all this, of course. I'm going to pinch myself and then I'll wake up." "Don't you dare wake up and leave me here," said Barney. "Well, pinch yourself at the same time," said Lou. They pinched themselves. Nothing happened. "Are you awake?" Barney asked. "No," replied Lou. "I know what," said Barney. "I'll pinch you." He pinched Lou and she squealed. "You don't have to do it so hard," she said. "Perhaps it's your dream and not mine. My turn to pinch you." She pinched him. "You beast, Lou, that hurts," said Barney. "Look, we can't both be dreaming the same dream, so we must be both awake. I wish we weren't." He took his eyes off the thing and turned to someone standing next to him. It was Stig. "Stig, thank goodness you're here," gasped Barney. "What is it? And what's going to happen?" Stig just looked at him at his usual not understanding way, but he grinned and he seemed really quite cheerful and not at all worried. "Lou, here's Stig," said Barney. "He seems to think it's all right." "Does he?" said Lou, looking round. "Well, perhaps it's a tame thing, or a usual thing anyhow." They felt better with Stig standing so cheerfully beside them, but Dinah suddenly decided that it was a thing she didn't like at all, turned tail, jerked the string from Lou's hand and bolted, with Lou after her shouting, "Dinah! Dinah, come back! Nice thing! Dinah! Dinah, come here!" And at the same time, Stig made a "come on" wave to Barney and some of the other men and started down the steep slope. Barney found himself running with him, panting, "I'm coming, Stig! Wait for me, Stig! Stig, wait! You haven't got your spear, Stig!" For he only just noticed that neither Stig nor the other men had brought their weapons with them. But now he had started running down the hillside. He knew he couldn't possibly stop, and he would be upon the thing before he had time to wonder any more what it was. The mist was the sort that wasn't there when you got to it, but spread the moonlight around like daylight, and Barney was still running down the last bit of hill when he could see quite plainly what it all was. The dark shape, the strings, the wails, the grunt, and the thump. On the track leading along the base of the hill was a crowd of tribesmen. They were divided into two groups. Those nearer to him were pulling on ropes. Those further away were working long poles, and the thing that they were manhandling was a great rough slab of dark rock, at least twice as high as the tallest man. And this was the way they were heaving it along. The slab of rock was lying flat on the ground. 12 men with pointed sticks pushed them under the edge of the rock and levered it about a foot off the ground. A much larger group of men pushed much longer poles under the rock as far as they would go, and lifted it still higher by pushing upwards on the poles. To the top ends of these poles, long ropes of twisted hide had been tied, which passed over the top of the rock to the men in front. When the rock was high enough, the men in front pulled all together on the ropes. The rock rose until it was standing upright, seemed to stop there for a second, and then fell forward with the mighty thump, that they had heard on the top of the hill. And the voice of the monster was the heave-ho of the men as they heaved together on the levers and ropes and grunted together at the difficult point where the rock was halfway to standing up. Barney was almost disappointed at the disappearance of the monster, but there was no time to stand around. The job was now to get the rock up the hill, and all the new helpers from the camp were needed. Without a pause in the slow footsteps of the rock, they joined in the work. Or rather, it was like joining in a game or a dance. Barney grabbed the end of a rope behind Stig and watched what he did. They faced the stone and had to walk towards it, while the men the other side lifted the poles back to fit them again under the rock. Then they had to take up the slack, but not pull until the rock was lifted to the halfway mark. Then, all together, with the men on the other two ropes, they had to take the strain, heave on the rope until the rock was standing upright, and then heave no more, for it was no use pulling the rock over towards them. It could fall by itself. Barney soon found it tiring, and wondered how long they could keep going like that. He started to say, "Wouldn't it be better if..." But as soon as he started talking, Stig trod on his toe, and then the rope was jerked through his hand as they lifted the poles back for the next heave. He noticed then that nobody was making suggestions. Nobody was arguing. Nobody was even giving orders. They just sang their wailing song. Pulled together, walked up a few steps together, rested together while the pole pushers worked, and Barney began to see that they could keep this up for hundreds of miles. And they probably had, because he couldn't think where they could find slabs of rock like this anywhere near. Of course, they couldn't go straight up the hill, it was too steep, but there was a grassy track slanting along the hillside, and up it they slowly humped the great rock. They were getting near the camp now, and the women and children ran out to meet them and shout encouragement. Barney heard a voice he recognised, and turned his head and saw Lou among them, holding an excited Dinah. "What are you going to do with it, Barney?" she was saying. "I can't help because I can't leave Dinah." But as soon as he paid attention to what Lou was saying, he got trodden on and jerked again. So he gave up trying to hear what she was shouting. He thought he heard her say, "Wouldn't it be better if you had wheels?" But there didn't seem to be much he could do about it. Now, although it was the steepest part of the track, they seemed to be going quicker. Barney had the feeling of being at the end of a race and making the final sprint. He looked round and saw the chief standing there alongside the track. He thought of Lou's question, and for the first time wondered what they were going to do with this lump of rock. He supposed it was some kind of present for the king. He hoped he would like it. With the last couple of quick heaves, they laid the rock almost at the feet of the king. One man said something short in a loud voice, and all the rope men and pole men fell on their faces towards the king. Barney did too. This time he was too tired to do anything else. The king raised his arm. More speeches, Barney thought, but no, it seemed that the job was not finished. He sat up and saw that leading away from where the rock lay was a sort of raised mound. The end of it was level with the ground, but the far end ran out to the tops of 3 other huge stones that were standing upright lower down the hillside. Barney thought he could see now what they had brought the slab all the way up the hill for. If they humped it along this mound, they could put it so it rested on top of the 3 standing stones, and there would be a house for the king, or a temple, or whatever it was that people put big stones across the top of others for. It seemed a grand idea to Barney. He could see now that it wasn't going to be the same as bringing it along the track. Now it was going downhill. If they weren't careful, it could go bounding away down the slope and even knock the standing stones flying like a lot of skittles. The old king stood speaking to the group of important men. He seemed to be pointing to the eastern sky with one hand and urging them on with the other. Barney looked towards where the king was pointing. Was the sky beginning to get light? Was it nearly morning? Was there something that had to be done before the night came to an end? Before the end of the shortest night, the night that seemed to be going on for such a long time. The women and children scrambled down the hill to get a good view of the standing stones, and there was a lot of scolding and cuffing of little ones who got themselves in the way of where the stone was to come. The men with the poles and ropes made ready again. This time it was different. Because of the steepness of the slope, they couldn't pull from the front, but had to do all the lifting and pushing from behind. And to stop the stone running away down the hill, there was a rope leading uphill behind it, with a lot of people hanging onto it to act as a brake. Stig took hold near the end of this, and Barney attached himself, last of all, as anchorman. There was no hearty heave-hoing this time. It was easy enough to lift the rock on edge, but then everybody watched anxiously as the brake rope was paid out and the rock was allowed to sink gently forward. There was no loud thump either, but a lot of hissing of breath and sighs of relief as each turnover was safely done. The steps along the top of the mound towards the top of the standing stones were even more anxious. One mistake and the stone could topple sideways off the mound and charge off downhill. Barney thought the women and children were standing dangerously close on each side, but they made 6 steps safely along the mound, each time letting the stone settle gently down by the brake rope. And now it was standing on its edge near the end of the mound, ready to be lowered on top of the standing stones. The king was looking anxiously at the sky, which now showed a bright glow over the shoulder of the downs to the east. Sunrise couldn't be far off. The workers on the brake rope took the strain as the stone began to fall forward. But what was this? Dinah, of all things, scrambling up the mound straight in front of the toppling stone, with Lou in desperate pursuit, and then Lou's voice shouting, "Stop! Stop! Don't let it down! There's a baby!" And there was Lou disappearing in front of the stone too. The stone was moving. Everyone on the brake rope was doing his best to hold it back, but once it had started, it was almost impossible. Barney on the end dug his heels into the slippery turf, but he could feel himself being dragged slowly forward. And then he saw it, just beside him on the hillside, a scrubby thorn tree, weather-beaten and stunted, but with strong roots clutching the earth. "Stig!" he gasped. "The tree!" Stig looked round and saw. With one hairy arm, Stig reached out and grabbed the trunk of the tree. The rope was wrapped around his other wrist, and his bones seemed to crackle as his arms took the strain. But the brake rope stopped moving forward. Trying not to fumble, Barney passed the end of the rope twice around the little tree and pulled it taut. Stig grinned as he saw he could let go. The hide rope stretched. The roots of the tree strained in the ground, but Barney let himself look at the stone and saw that it was not moving. And then Lou appeared from under the tilted stone, followed by Dinah, and carrying a naked, black-haired Stig baby. The king shouted impatiently. Barney let the end of the rope run out round the tree trunk. The great slab fell forward with a hollow sound on the tops of the standing stones, and over the shoulder of the downs appeared a red spark, and the valley was flooded with light. It was sunrise. From the low mist in the bottom of the valley appeared the spire of a church, the tops of oast houses, and electricity pylons. The solid forest was gone, and there were squares of cornfield, orchard and hop garden. There were the villages and the distant chimneys of cement works, and the broad ribbon of the main road sweeping down the hill below. Barney looked around the hillside. The people of the tribe had disappeared. There were no huts, no sign of a campfire. They had all vanished with the last shades of darkness. But one thing had not changed. The 3 stones, with the great slab on top, were still before his eyes, weathered now, with grey lichen growing on them. The mound was not there, but the stones stood just as they had done when they had let go of the last of the rope. Sitting against them was Lou, blinking her eyes at the rising sun, as if she was waking from a deep sleep, and holding Dinah in her arms. "Oh, Barney, I've had such a funny dream," said Lou sleepily. "I'm glad I've woken up, though." "So did I," said Barney. "Are you sure we've woken up?" Lou looked around. "Well, I dreamt about a tribe of people long ago," she said. "They've all gone, and now it's now, so it must have been a dream." "What are we doing here, then?" asked Barney. Lou opened her eyes at that. "Good gracious," she said. "We don't usually wake up on top of a hill, do we?" She curled herself up at the foot of the stone and shut her eyes. "I'm going to dream myself back to bed," she said firmly. Barney shook her. "Get up, Lou," he said. "It isn't that sort of dream at all. We really are here. We've got to get back to Granny's somehow." Barney knew that it was something more than a dream. The tiredness in his arms and legs told him that he really had been hauling the great stone that looked as if it had been there for thousands of years. He walked around to the front of the stones where the open side looked over the valley, and there, sitting in the entrance as if he was on his own porch, was Stig. Barney gaped and Stig grinned. Lou put her head round the stone and gasped too. "Stig!" she exclaimed. "What are you doing here? If you're a midsummer fairy, or whatever the others were, you're supposed to vanish too." "But I told you," said Barney. "Stig's always here. He's my friend." Barney and Lou have almost forgotten how they got back to the house that summer morning. They remember catching the pony, who was grazing peacefully on the hilltop, and riding back half asleep, clitter-clatter through the empty lanes, with Stig walking beside them. And they remember falling into their beds and waking very late on Midsummer Day. Probably they agreed on the way back not to say anything about what had happened. Anyhow, what could they say? It wasn't until quite a long time later that they went with their parents for a picnic on the North Downs where the 4 stones stand. And as they ate their sandwiches, their parents got into an argument about Stone Ages and Bronze Ages and how the stones had got there at all, until Barney said, without thinking, "They had flint spears, and it was heave-ho that did it." And everybody thought about this quite a lot, and had to admit that Barney was probably right, although they couldn't think how he knew. And then Barney and Lou said together, "But I wonder how the baby got there." And that was a question no one could answer. And what about Stig? Well, if you ask Barney, he will say in an offhand manner that he's still living in the dump. The grown-ups never really knew just how real he was, but they got used to the idea that whenever there was a pile of old thrown-away things, an unseen Stig was likely to be poking around in it. And whenever there was a particularly odd job to be done, like making sure a rainwater butt didn't spring a leak when it was empty and overflow when it was full, or a new tool for lifting parsnips, then someone would say, "Let's get Stig to fix it." Actually, the dump's filling up fast now, and Stig may be on the move. One report was that he'd been seen working at a garage by the main road, where they collect old wrecked cars and put the pieces in rusty piles. And somebody said that they saw him in the back lane of that woody country at the top of the downs, mending a chicken run with an old wire mattress. It certainly sounded like Barney's friend Stig, but perhaps it was only a relative of his.